Hello everyone and welcome to Art Studio. If you are new to the channel, welcome, and if you are a returner, welcome back. This channel delves into the obscure, strange, and fascinating histories of the Warhammer universe. We strive to uncover and explore rarely discussed and little known histories. This channel also showcases art and miniatures. I try to update weekly and bi-weekly. Hope you enjoy the videos and please subscribe. Today we dive into the mysterious entity known as Tau Va, a mysterious manifestation of the Tau Empire's philosophy of the greater good. What lies within the warp that reflects the ideals of unity and purpose? Is it a benevolent force shaped by the Tau's collective belief, or something far more sinister? Let's uncover the secrets of this warp-born anomaly and its implications for the galaxy. The Tau Chaos God, known as Tau Va, is a darkly benevolent figure born from the crucible of the fourth sphere of expansion, where the Tau's daring experiments with warp technology inadvertently gave rise to this mysterious entity. Far from the savage cruelty of the other Chaos Gods, Tau Va appears to embody a paradoxical vision of peace through unity, offering a twisted form of salvation. Unlike the traditional Chaos Gods, Tau Va does not draw its power from the psychic energy of the warp, but instead derives on the collective zeal, unwavering dogma, and oppressive unity of its followers. To its followers, it is a guiding light in the chaos of the universe, promising an existence free from conflict, doubt, and the burdens of individuality. It whispers of a perfected greater good, where all are harmonized in thought and purpose, under its watchful gaze. Yet, beneath this benevolent facade lies an unsettling truth. Tau Va's unity comes at the cost of free will, its kindness a tool to bind all souls into its all-encompassing collective. It is not cruelty that drives this god, but an unyielding, cold compassion that reshapes the galaxy in its image, a dark mirror of the ideals that once inspired the Tau Empire. The rise of Tau Va can be traced back to the catastrophic fourth sphere of expansion, a bold but ill-fated endeavor by the Tau Empire to extend their dominion across the stars. Employing the experimental AL-38 slipstream module drive to circumvent the challenges of faster-than-light travel, the Tau fleet was inadvertently cast into the immaterium, a realm of whirling chaos and psychic energies, utterly alien to the Tau's understanding of the universe. Though the Tau's natural resistance to the warp initially shielded them, the sheer scale of exposure to the raw warp began to fracture their collective psyche. As they drifted through the maelstrom, desperate for survival and clinging to the ideals of the greater good, their fear, hope, and unity coalesced into something new, something different. In the heart of the warp, these emotions grew into a coalesced, sentient force, a godlike entity shaped by the Tau's need for order in a universe of chaos, the universe of the warp. When the fleet finally emerged back into real space, its survivors carried with them the influence of this darkening and benevolent figure, its whispers urging a unified vision of salvation through harmony, even at the cost of individuality. Thus, Tau Va was born, a divine reflection of the Tau's ideals, twisted by the unrelenting truths of the warp. To understand how all this correlates, we must understand the fundamentals of Tau warp travel technology. An ether drive, alternately known as a gravitic drive, is a propulsion system utilized by Tau voidcraft to achieve faster-than-light travel by momentarily breaching the boundary between real space and the warp. Distinct from the Imperial warp drives, which fully submerge a starship in the turbulent currents of the immaterium for rapid transit, the Tau's ether drive permits only a controlled, fleeting dip into warp space. This design enables Tau vessels to attain subliminal velocities when measured from the vantage of real space, though their interstellar journeys remain significantly slower compared to the capabilities of other xenospecies or even Imperial warp travel. The ether drive is considered generally inferior to the Imperial warp drive in terms of speed and efficiency for interstellar travel, While the Imperial Warp Drive fully enters a warp and uses its chaotic, mutable nature to significantly reduce travel time across vast distances, the Tau Ether Drive only allows for brief dives into warp space, limiting its ability to exploit the warp's time dilation and distance compression effects. A journey that might take years in real space could be reduced to weeks or even days within the warp for Imperial Warp Drives, versus Ether Drive powered ships that can take far longer to traverse and travel the same interstellar distances. Imperial Warp Drives also offer greater navigational flexibility, allowing ships to traverse vast regions of the galaxy in a single jump, though it is not recommended. However, it does require the assistance of a navigator, a psychic human mutant attuned to the warp, to avoid the dangers and chart a course safely. Tau Ether Drives are far more simple and much more safer for the Tau because they lack any true psychers. But its limited engagement with warp space prevents it from achieving the vast leaps possible with Imperial Warp Drive technology. The Tau Earthcast, driven by their great ambitions for the Tau Empire, sought to bridge the glaring gap between the Tau Ether Drive technology and the incredible warp travel technologies of the Imperium. Lacking any true psychers and any substantive understanding of the warp or the immaterium, they approached the problem with a charismatic pragmatism, focusing on theoretical physics and advanced gravitational manipulation, not understanding the true nature of the warp. Their efforts culminated into the creation of the Nexus Annihilation Drive, a bold and untested experiment designed to replace warp-like travel without requiring full immersion in the immaterium. The drive aimed to tear controlled breaches between real space and the warp, allowing ships to traverse vast interstellar distances in the way that mirrored Imperial warp travel technology, but in the Tau's own words, it was safer. However, this ignorance of the warp's volatile nature led to catastrophic consequences. When activated, the Nexus Annihilation Drive thrusts the fourth sphere of expansion fleet into the depths of the immaterium, unprepared and completely unprotected. This reckless venture not only jeopardized the fleet but also planted the seeds for the rise of the Tau Chaos God, a grim testament to the dangers of exploring forbidden realms without true comprehension. The Tau's relationship with the warp is one of profound ignorance, limited interaction, and somewhat of a natural resistance. Unlike most other species in the Milky Way galaxy, the Tau are almost completely disconnected from the immaterium due to their extremely weak psychic presence in the warp. The Tau possess only the most rudimentary understanding of the warp. Their scientific and materialistic worldwide views dismisses this mystical and spiritual dimension that other species associate with the immaterium, or what they call the warp. To the Tau, the warp is seen as a mysterious but exploitable force of physics rather than a dimension teeming with malevolent entities and psychic phenomena. They lack psychers, navigators, and the spiritual traditions that other species use to comprehend or interact with the warp, leaving them blind to its true dangers. One of the defining features of the Tau is their extremely weak connection to the warp. Unlike humans, Eldar, or even to a lesser degree, orcs, the Tau do not produce any significant psionic emissions. While the Tau are highly resistant to the warp and warp corruption, and even chaos influence, they also lack the psychic resonance that demons and other warp entities typically exploit. So therefore the Tau are not shining beacons in the warp like other species in the Milky Way galaxy. But this same weakness also means that the Tau are unable to use psychic powers, perceive warp phenomena, or safely navigate its chaotic currents. The Tau's apparent resistance to psychic corruption of the warp is not due to any innate resilience or special protection, but rather their almost negligible psychic presence in the warp. Unlike humans, Eldar, or other psychically attuned species, the Tau emit only the faintest ripple in the immaterium, making them effectively invisible to predatory entities within the warp. This minuscule psychic signature also allows them to go largely unnoticed by demons and other malevolent warp entities that feed on psychic energy. However, this is not a true resistance. It is more akin to being too small a target to attract any real attention. Should the Tau be exposed to prolonged warp energies or significant enough psychic disturbances, they remain vulnerable to the corrupting influence of chaos, as evidenced by the events of the fourth sphere of expansion. The so-called immunity is a byproduct of their insignificance in the psychic plane, not an inherent safeguard against the horrors of the immaterium. As stated before, the Tau's first and only major experimentation with new warp travel technology occurred with the fourth sphere of expansion. The fourth sphere of expansion was an ambitious effort by the Tau Empire to expand their dominion using, as we talked about, this experimental technology. This included the development of the Nexus annihilation device, or drive, a method of faster-than-light travel akin to, like we said, the Imperial warp drives. However, the attempt was catastrophic, resulting in the incident that gave birth to the Chaos Warp God of the Tau. This hurled the fleet into the immaterium, but the Tau perceived it as a sub-reality, not realizing that they were in the heart of the warp. In order to gain a true understanding of why the Tau Empire was so desperate to use a dangerous and untested technology to thrust them in the warp, we have to realize and look at where they were at this historical juncture. Following the tumultuous events of the Second Agrellan Campaign, the Tau Empire found its expansionist ambitions gripped by a profound strategic impasse. The vital pathway through Magulath Bay, a keystone of their growth, was irrevocably obstructed. To the galactic east, the scars left by High Fleet Gorgon stretched across the desolate expanse, a barren and inhospitable void rendered unfit for colonization. Meanwhile, the western front was dominated by the unyielding power of the Necron Sutek dynasty, whose supremacy cast a shadow over any prospects of advancement. As the Empire struggled to reassess its strategies, the catastrophic formation of the Great Rift shattered any semblance of stability. This rift, with its ferocious warp-borne storms and currents, tore through the Tau's territory, annihilating fleets and severing lines of communication, and snuffing out millions of lives in an instant. The culmination of all these events pushed the Tau Empire into a crisis, forcing them to confront the limits of their reach in the galaxy as it descended into chaos around them. In a bold and perilous gambit to reignite their halted ambitions, the Tau Empire, under the Ethereal Council, sanctioned a radical initiative to achieve faster-than-light travel on par with the Imperium. Decades of meticulous study into Imperial warp drive technology culminated into the creation of the AL-38 Slipstream module, a marvel of Tau engineering designed to propel their fleets to unprecedented speeds within the warp. With this breakthrough, a new sphere of expansion was proclaimed, and it was entrusted to the command of the renowned Commander Surestrike. The fleet assembled at Numenor Point, a vast armada poised to push the boundaries of Tau dominion. However, the immense scale of the operation overwhelmed the untested Slipstream modules. The simultaneous activation of these devices generated destabilizing antimatter distortions, rupturing the fabric of real space. The resulting catastrophic cascade tore open a rift of incomprehensible proportions, consuming the entirety of Surestrike's forces in an instant. The calamity witnessed across the Tau Empire via transmitted fragments sent shockwaves through its leadership. The Ethereal Council, faced with this profound implication of the disaster, moved swiftly to suppress all knowledge of the event, shrouding the catastrophe in secrecy to protect the unity of the Empire and their people. The fourth sphere of expansion, though battered and nearly annihilated, was not entirely lost to the void of the warp. Thrust into the warp of the Immaterium without any safeguards, an estimated 3/4 of the fleet succumbed to the predations of warp demons and other entities, beings far beyond the comprehension of any Tau. In the midst of this calamity, the fleet's remnants found salvation through the intervention of a many-limbed presence within the warp, the Tau Chaos God, Tau Va. These Tau survivors eventually re-emerged in the Chalnoth Expanse, a renowned region firmly entrenched within the Imperium of Man. Years of tenuous isolation followed, but communication was re-established using advanced drone technology through the newly stabilized rift that was created accidentally from the activation of the experimental Tau warp drives. It was designated the Startide Nexus. This cosmic passage became a vital artery for the launch of the fifth sphere of expansion, enabling the Tau to exploit this connection through the expanse. The site of the fourth sphere's expansion initial return, now fortified in this new atoll, as a strategic stronghold and testament to the resilience of the Tau Empire in the face of the unknown. The Tau of the fourth sphere of expansion, cast into the depths of the Immaterium, endured trials that reshaped their very essence. Isolated in an alien realm of nightmarish proportions, these survivors clung desperately to the core tenet of their society, the Tau Va, or the greater good. Yet, their prolonged exposure to the warp's strange energies and horrors that preyed upon them began to twist this principle into something far more darker. In their desperation, the fragmented remnants of the fleet collectively manifested a being they believed to be the living embodiment of the Tau Va. This entity, otherworldly and many-limbed, radiated power and unity, becoming their beacon of hope in this endless abyss of torment. However, salvation came at a cost. This entity, while seemingly aligned with their ideals, altered them in ways that were both subtle and profound. The survivors emerged from the warp not as the optimistic pioneers they once were, but as somber, brooding figures. Their once bright vision of the greater good replaced by a grim, militant zeal. Anger and resentment simmered beneath their renewed purpose. Fueled by their perceived betrayal by the galaxy's natural order and the hardships they endured, their faith in Tau Va became unyielding and dogmatic, driving them to impose their vision of unity through force and fear rather than persuasion and cooperation. This transformation marked a stark departure from the Tau Empire's ideals. While they still professed loyalty to the Ethereal Council, the Fourth Sphere's survivors acted with a ruthless determination that unsettled even their own kin. Their once bright belief in a harmonious collective had been reforged into the crucible of the warp. Now a weaponized doctrine born of suffering and anger, a dark reflection of the Tau Va that had guided them. The Tau of the fourth sphere of expansion, profoundly altered by their exposure to the raw warp and their worship of the manifestation of Tau Va, have evolved into a dark and fanatical force. This once idealistic faction, originally devoted to diplomacy and the inclusion of other species under the greater good, has become a brutal and xenophobic shadow of its former self. Their faith in Tau Va, no longer a philosophy but a godlike entity born of their collective suffering, has driven them to view all who resist or fail to meet their rigid standards as irredeemable threats to this divine vision. For this new faction, non-allied species are no longer seen as potential converts or cooperative partners, but as enemies needing to be exterminated. Entire populations have been wiped out in merciless purges, their deaths framed as necessary sacrifices for Tau Va's perfection. Even those who once served the Tau willingly, such as human auxiliaries, are no longer spared from this onslaught. This xenophobia extends even to the Tau's own historical allies and kin. Survivors of the fourth sphere of expansion view themselves as the chosen heralds of Tau Va's will, regarding other Tau as weak or insufficiently devoted. Their dogmatic interpretation of the greater good demands absolute obedience and conformity, leaving no room for dissent or differing approaches. Those who fail to align with their vision are treated with suspicion or outright hostility, further dividing the Tau Empire. This brutal faction of the fourth sphere now wages war, not to unite but to dominate, spreading their corrupted vision of the Tau Va through fear, bloodshed, and annihilation. Their faith, twisted and darkened by their experiences, has transformed them into zealots who embody the very tyranny and violence the Tau once sought to rise above. Their existence is a grim warning of how even the noblest ideals can be weaponized when warped by desperation and suffering. Seeing this further spread of a shocking ideology, Commander Shadowsun and the Ethereal Council imposed severe disciplinary measures upon the commanders of the Fourth Sphere, subjecting them to the ancient symbolic punishment known as Malk La. This ritualistic reprimand served both as a means of chastisement and as a symbolic cleansing of their transgressions, after which the chastised officers were either reintegrated into their military units or recalled to the Tau Empire for ideological realignment and reconditioning. However, tensions reached a breaking point in the aftermath of the violent insurrection of the colony world of Kaisan, where a catastrophic Kroot rebellion culminated in widespread slaughter. In response to this blood-soaked betrayal, the Ethereal Council decreed the complete removal of all auxiliary forces from the Fourth Sphere of Expansion's contingents, severing the bonds of collaboration in favor of a pure, more insular Tau force that would not have any more contact with other forces. Within the secretive chambers of the Ethereal Council, a growing unease festers over the nature of Tau Va, the deity that emerged from the Fourth Sphere's ill-fated journey through the warp. The Ethereals, guided by centuries of pragmatic ideology and spiritual doctrine, have begun to suspect that this supposed goddess of the greater good is in truth a malevolent demon spawned from the despair and desperation of the Empire's auxiliary species. The auxiliary species, long treated as subordinates despite their vital contributions, have had their anguish and disillusionment amplified within the psychic miasma of the warp. This collective suffering, the ethereal sphere, manifested Tau Va, not as an extension of the greater good, but as a twisted reflection of auxiliaries' wounded faith and suppressed resentment. The aftermath of the Startide Nexus creation further deepened the Council's concerns. While the auxiliaries turned to Tau Va in devout worship, seeing her as their salvation, the Tau of the Fourth Sphere were also filled with disgust and fury. To some of them, this entity was no divine avatar of unity, but a corruption of the Tau Va's philosophy, a being born from the auxiliaries' betrayal and directly tied to the demonic activities and attacks that ravaged their fleet. Convinced that the auxiliaries' devotion to this false god was the source of their plight, the Fourth Sphere's Tau initiated a brutal campaign of extermination, slaughtering their former allies in a desperate attempt to sever the demon's influence. They believed that by eradicating the auxiliaries, they could destroy the corruption that Tau Va had spread amongst their fleet and restore what they believed to be the greater good. For the Ethereal Council, the implications are catastrophic. Tau Va's glowing influence, spreading from the Fourth Sphere of Expansion and beyond, threatens to destabilize the Tau Empire, not just militarily, but ideologically. The Tau's cornerstone belief in the greater good is at risk of being consumed by fanaticism and xenophobia, as the Tau Va's presence fosters division, mistrust, and also bloodshed. If left unchecked, this demon could devour the Tau Empire from within, turning its vision of harmony and unity into a nightmare of domination and destruction. The Ethereals now grapple with a harrowing truth. The very ideas that once defined their civilization may have birthed a force capable of undoing it entirely. Unknowingly for some of the Tau of the Fourth Sphere of Expansion, they became the very embodiment of Tau Va, as they sought to destroy the auxiliaries around them. Believing their brutal campaign of extermination against the auxiliaries was a righteous purge of those who betrayed the greater good, they failed to see that their actions mirrored the zeal and rage that defined the entity they so despised. In their unwavering conviction, their anger and fanaticism transformed them into agents of Tau Va's will, spreading its corrupted vision of unity through fear, bloodshed, and oppression. Every act of slaughter, every proclamation of purity was not a rejection of Tau Va, but an enactment of its twisted existence. A paradoxical realization that the greater their efforts to rid themselves of its influence, the more deeply they lived up to its doctrine. But the existence of Tal Va can actually be traced back far further in the past. Commander Shadowsun's mysterious encounter with the entity known as Tal Va came about during her early training under Pure Tide, and this may have played a pivotal role in a manifestation of this goddess. Stranded in near death within a labyrinth beneath Mount Kanji, Shadowsun's desperation and determination reached a breaking point. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Tal Va appeared as a translucent figure, offering her salvation in the form of air, or oxygen. This apparition introduced itself not as an individual being but as the embodiment of unity and destiny, the very essence of the greater good made manifest. Shadowsun, skeptical yet desperate, reluctantly accepted this aid, unknowingly granting Tal Va the permission to exist in the physical realm. While Shadowsun later dismissed the encounter as a hallucination or ghostly vision, the implications are profound. Her willingness to engage with the entity, even in her disbelief, may have seeded Tal Va's existence within the psychic ether. The combination of her faith in the greater good, her immense potential as a leader, and the intense circumstances of a near-death experience may have created a psychic resonance strong enough to give form to the goddess. This encounter not only saved Shadowsun, but could have laid the foundation for the eventual emergence of Tal Va as a force tied to Tal's collective ideologies and their darkest vulnerabilities. Shadowsun's memory of this event, lingering and unresolved, might hint at a deeper connection between her and the entity, suggesting that her presence and actions were the instrumental unit in bringing Tal Va into being. Recent events involving the Chaos Space Marine Death Guard have irrevocably entrenched Tal Va into Tal society, embedding this entity within the fabric of their entire civilization. The brutal invasion of the Lemyar Atoll by the Death Guard forces initially saw Commander Shadowsun, skeptical of the goddess's existence, ordering the destruction of all of her temples. However, desperation in the face of the Death Guard's relentless advance drove her to seek aid from the auxiliaries who still worshipped the goddess Tal Va. Their fervent prayers during key battle engagements against the Chaos Forces seemingly invoked Tal Va's power, leading to inexplicable shifts in the conflict, including the splinter of the Death Guard's fleet and forces, and the eventual entrapment of their ships within the warp itself. Shadowsun's experience of Tal Va's influence through both prayers of her auxiliaries and the goddess's apparent intervention rekindled memories of her own life-saving encounter with the entity during her youth. This profound realization prompted her to halt the destruction of the temples and allow Tal Va to take root as a force among the Tau and their auxiliaries. Though still not universally worshipped by the Tau themselves, the goddess's presence has become impossible to ignore. With temples preserved and her influence credited for turning the tide against the Death Guard, Tal Va has firmly established itself as a spiritual and cultural cornerstone of some within the Tau Empire. It is now forever altering the Tau's ideological landscape. With the emergence of Tal Va, this represents a dark turning point for the Tau Empire, reflecting the perils of ambition, desperation, and unintended consequences of grappling with forces beyond their comprehension. Born from the catastrophic experiments of the fourth sphere of expansion, Tal Va embodies a twisted vision of the greater good, promising unity and salvation but demanding absolute conformity and the sacrifice of individuality. Its rise illustrates a fragile balance between ideals and fanaticism, as the Tau's unwavering pursuit of harmony through technology and ideological enhancements inadvertently birthed a being that corrupts their own core values. As Tal Va's influence spreads, it serves as both a symbol of hope and an ominous warning, threatening to reshape the Tau Empire in a dark reflection of its original vision, where unity is achieved not through cooperation but through fear, domination, and bloodshed. The story of Tal Va is a grim testament to the dangers of hubris and a haunting realization that even the noblest ideas can be weaponized when faced with the unyielding chaos of the galactic landscape.
Thank you, and may the Emperor's light guide our every step, ensuring victory against the darkness that threatens humanity's future.